I'll get started. We're still waiting on one of our panellists, but I'll kick it off so we don't run over. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Layla Busbar, and I am Head of Overseas Visits and Events at the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and we're absolutely delighted to be hosting this event today with the Global Partnership for Education. In my role as Head of Overseas Visits, I've had the privilege of taking members of Parliament all over the world to see the work being done to improve access to girls' education. So it really is an honour for me today to be chairing this panel. On the panel, we will have Theo Clark, Member of Parliament for Stafford and a GPE UK champion. We have Professor Dominic McVeigh, a member of our Advisory Council, but also a fantastic thought leader, entrepreneur and philanthropist. And we have Healy Yoon, the founder of Afghan Youth Ambassadors for Peace organisation and a GPE Youth UK leader. Healy has trained over 100 boys and girls on gender equality, so she's absolutely fantastic, and I'm in a bit of awe being on this panel with her today. I'll start by telling you a little bit about the coalition. We'll then go into a panel discussion before I open it out to audience questions. The Coalition for Global Prosperity was set up because we believe that Britain is at its best when it acts as a force for good in the world, and that a smart and effective aid budget, leveraging British expertise, can and does transform lives all across the world. Before the pandemic, we had over 130 million girls already out of education, and poverty was the deciding factor whether a girl went to school or not. Girls that don't go to school are at an increased risk of forced marriage, gender-based violence, and so on. We know this. That traps them into a vicious cycle of poverty. So there's no doubt that ensuring women and girls have the same rights as men and boys is moral and ethical. We know that. But it also makes economic sense. Gender inequality in the economy costs women in developing countries over 9 trillion a year, a sum that would give so much power to women, families, and communities. The UK does have a proud record of putting international development and women at the core of everything they do on the world stage. And we influence others to do the same. So in today's event, we're going to explore how we can use this as a catalyst for change, and how we can ensure that women and girls always reach their full potential wherever they are in the world. And with that, my first question is for Dominic. Dominic, do you see prioritising girls' education as a foreign policy imperative to the UK, and why?
Quite simply, yes, I do. I do see it as an imperative. I think it's not just imperative to our foreign policy, but also domestic policy. You know, a huge amount of work has gone on to ensure getting as many women into higher education here in the UK, but the challenges are even greater in the developing countries. A lot of my experience in recent years is investing and creating jobs in sub-Saharan Africa. My last business that I took public, we were employing over 20,000 people across Kenya, Ethiopia, and more lately in Egypt. 98% of my workforce, my colleagues, are female. And we found that where we were able to provide further education, further support, whether it be financial literacy, computer education, how to deal with sexual harassment, reading, writing. In Ethiopia, we were working with communities where basic hygiene was not understood, and the factories that I had developed there were manufacturing underwear for women for the US market. Now, if someone returns from a comfort break or their lunch with dirty hands, it damages the goods. So where I sit in education, I know there's a lot of focus today on the formal curricula, but there is so much in society of which often women have been overlooked or put to one side. But the reality is, to build a successful business with the local community, it has to encompass and be led by the women, who are often the leaders, the unheard leaders in those communities. And without the education, I would not have been able to create businesses. Now, your question is it right for the UK's international policy to put girls at the forefront? Well, I think the UK's international policy, particularly under this leadership, is about exports and imports. So if we're going to work with countries, we need to support countries, particularly women, in job creation. Without that job creation, who are we going to trade with? And ultimately, it is a civic duty, it's our right as a society that can afford to help others into education. We must help others into education in the global societies that we live in. I was quite shocked and appalled, often turning up in certain communities where the statistics look great. I chair a charity called Computer Aid International. Most people in sub-Saharan Africa, I would say around 4% have access to a computer. I was interviewing people for jobs for simple accounting roles, for example, who had computer science degrees, never had access or seen a computer before. So the quality and the level of education that we want to deliver to the world under international development policy has to be relevant and of value. The other thing that we know, for example, where computers are, a computer lab might be in a university, let's say in outside of Nairobi, and there's limited access to computers. Women are often bullied out of using those computers. So not only are they struggling to get into the education system, we're seeing that where there are opportunities for people to get ahead, often the women are pushed to one side. So there's so much to dive into this, but what I do know is that educated women makes better communities, makes a better world, and men, particularly those that have a voice that can advocate, must stand up and fight for that right for education for women across the world.
Brilliant, thank you, Dominic. Hila, can I ask you the same question? Do you see prioritising girls' education as a foreign policy imperative for the UK?
Definitely. So, because I come from Afghanistan, and if you're watching the news and haven't keep up updating with what's happening in Afghanistan, we're the only country in the world where it's been more than 2 years where girls have been completely banned from schools, from universities, and even having a job. So when we talk about any developing country considering themselves as a champion of education, I think if they're not helping a country where millions of girls are completely out of education, we shouldn't call ourselves champions of education. Now, why is it so important? Because UK has a moral obligation to certain countries. In Afghanistan, we have been center of war for decades, and I don't want to show an image of Afghan women just as a victims, because in the way media portrays what's happening in Afghanistan and women, we do need support as a helping hand to what's happening in Afghanistan and how we can empower and educate women. I mean, all of you are experts here, you know how the value of education. But sometimes in these conferences, what we don't have is a grassroots voice, people who can come and speak to you on what's happening at the local level and how women are actually the champions of education in their communities, despite all these problems that they are facing. Now, why should this be a center of foreign policy for the UK? Because I said it's a moral obligation. If a country when women are not educated, it's going to create regional problems and it will lead to international problems. Considering the refugee crisis in here and how a lot of people in Afghanistan or any conflict zone, one reason people leave the country is conflict, poverty, but also if a country where they don't see a future for their daughters, they will leave. So in order to tackle these issues, education is the key for any solution. And coming from Afghanistan, in my family, I'm the only one person in my family as a girl who actually have access to this platform and who have completed her education. So I'm one example where I can bring changes in my community. And this change starts with the local level. When I started my organization, obviously there were so many obstacles in Afghanistan for a woman to continue education, even before the Taliban took over. But we overcome those challenges and we're still doing it. But what we need is a helping hand. We don't want others to represent us. We need representation. We need the platform so we can raise our voices, raise our concern. We need a helping hand on the ground. And if Afghanistan is left, it's gonna cause regional problems. It's gonna cause international problems. And we cannot achieve SDG goals at the international level if we're leaving one country behind and consider ourselves as champion of education, where like millions of women are completely banned from education. And there are so many ways you can provide help, not just every person who are present in this conference, in this room, there are so many ways as you as an individual can support an Afghan woman or any girls in a developing countries so they can continue their education. And I will come to the solutions more, but this is why I will keep emphasizing that education should be a key center for the UK foreign policies, and not just in the UK but at international level as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Hila. And Theo, thank you so much for joining us today. I've introduced you as the fantastic Member of Parliament from Stafford and UK champion for GPE. Theo, I'm going to come to you with a question. What was your experience like in education, and how has that shaped your life?
Well, firstly, apologies for being late. My Secretary of State was speaking on the main stage, so I've hot-footed it back. I'm delighted to join you today. I think firstly for me, I think education really is a silver bullet, both in the UK but also internationally, because it leads on to your job and your career for the rest of your life. I just got back from Kenya last week as the Prime Minister's trade envoy, and it was really interesting meeting with British businesses working in Nairobi, and they were talking about the pipeline of future talent so they can deliver on the projects I signed, like one of our hydroelectric dams being built in the west of the country. And it was really striking to me how if you don't have a skilled labour force of people who can deliver on those projects, you won't be able to firstly tackle unemployment, but also to lift people out of poverty. So for me, education is absolutely critical. In my own constituency in Stafford, I'm doing a big campaign on literacy and trying to improve reading in my local schools. And really, if you don't have those basic attributes of reading and writing, the impact on the rest of your life is going to be very difficult. So for me, that's what investing both in education domestically and internationally is really critical.
Fantastic, thank you. Hila, what was your experience of education like? I'm sure you have a different view.
So I'm from the eastern part of Afghanistan, and like I said, in my family, I'm the only person, a female, who actually went abroad, studied, and I'm representing the voices of millions of Afghan women here. Because first, my family supported me when it comes to education. In Afghanistan, I did all my studies in Afghanistan, and there was a lot of obstacles when it comes to education. But through education, I learned a lot about how I can help other women in my community. Because obviously, if I don't know what I need to know and how to help them, I don't think I can achieve anything. In Afghanistan, both my families, they lived through civil war. My mom is a champion of education. I get inspiration from her. My dad is a professor. So considering that background in my family, it's really important how they encourage me, because it starts with the family as well. During civil war, my mom was shot 2 times, and she survived. But my grandpa and my family members, they continued to encourage her to continue education. And that's kind of inspiration as well for me, and same for my family. When I was studying my undergrads in Afghanistan in 2017, we had a terrorist attack on our university where I lost 11 of my classmates and colleagues, and we were stuck till 4 a.m. But even after that, I continued education because I know the power of education and the social changes that can bring through education in my community. And I started my own organization in Afghanistan called the Afghan Youth Ambassador for Peace. I was just 19 years old and really ambitious, trying to make a social change in a country where it's quite difficult. But throughout the years, I've learned a lot. In order to make any changes in any communities, you need to have patience and you need to have education. When we started working in the eastern provinces, there were so many problems for education. It's not just religion issues. There was no financial aid to even have schools. Like I studied in a school where we only were sitting outside classroom. We didn't have any tables or like chairs. We were just sitting on the ground and studying. So I'm here representing and attending these big conferences. Like it kind of gives you a different perspective that, okay, education has led me to attend these conferences and speak about Afghanistan and what's happening. But I want to bring this personal story because education was the reason why I'm here and representing the voices of million Afghan women and girls who are deprived from education. And when I started my organization, I learned that through education we can make social changes. That's why when I started working with religious leaders, tribal leaders, because in order to actually have an effective change in their community, all the stakeholders needs to be involved. And I'm a keen advocate for localization. Whenever we talk about educational policies at international level, it just sticks to these conferences. It never leaves this room. we need localization. Changes needs to become from within the countries and within the local communities. So that's why when it comes to education, I started working with different leaders, and we were advocating for girls' education from Islamic perspective, and advocating for, that's why we train more than 100 young girls and women on education and leadership, because in order to make changes, we need to empower young women at the local level, and that's what the change starts. So education personally for me have helped me a lot, both on my professional level and personal level in different areas of life. And I can talk about so many benefits of having education, but we all know how education can help a woman and how she can make a social change in their community. And I think this should be a key area and prioritize key areas for any countries. Help women at the local level, and they will make changes at the local level.
Thank you, Hila. Before I hand over to you, because I know you have a couple of questions for Thea, I've got one more question for you, Dominic.
Thank you.
And that is, what can the UK do to protect education in conflict zones?
Well, big question.
Good question.
Big question. But I think there's a couple of approaches to this. I think COVID is a good example, although not a conflict in the UK, certainly created dividing lines, but we saw universities and teachers become heroes from their bedrooms at home, teaching children in their bedrooms at home, and that kept the young people of Britain up to speed with their curriculum. Of course, there were challenges, there was a number of criticisms, but ultimately it was a huge feat of success. I think when education starts to become impacted in conflict zones, with technology, with the lessons that we've learned, with the ways that distance learning has evolved, I would like to think that there are interventions that can be made in similar ways when disaster or conflict strike, of which they are doing far too regularly, of which we must continue to maintain the level of education for those that are affected. I've spent time in a number of refugee camps, one being in northern Kenya in Kakuma, which is on the border with South Sudan. An incredible place of 250,000 people from a number of backgrounds, number of countries across the region. I met young men there that were given access, and young women that were given access to digital education, and through that were able to apply for scholarships. A young lady ended up getting a scholarship to Princeton despite being made homeless from the internal conflicts that they have in Ethiopia, for example. So we're starting to see where education can be deployed from a distance, that we can, to some degree, continue to support. So I know the University of Wales, where I'm a professor at, when there was a climate disaster in the Caribbean, in Grenada, we were able to support a number of students whose education had been interrupted to continue their education in Swansea. Yeah. We also looked at the university is very forward-thinking, extremely well leading at recognising refugees that have come to the UK whose studies have been interrupted. So we will work with the institutions in their home countries of which they've had to flee from, and support them in recognising some of the credits that they've built up in their countries at home, and seeing how we can bring people in to make sure that although the conflict has no doubt caused huge trauma and setbacks, what can we do as an institution of education to support those on those journeys, to make sure that that journey of education is not interrupted? There's a lot of talented people in this room with a lot of good ideas, I'm sure. There must be more ways as well, and I hope through the conversations that we have, where we can get education to people on the ground and get it to them quickly, making sure courses can be uploaded, working with the local institutions where we fear that there may be a risk of conflict. How do they start to digitise their curriculums? How do they start to gain access to people? Now, of course, there's the issues with access to internet, but Starlink's doing a pretty good job with that. Through my charity, Computer Aid, we have a big issue of getting access to IT, but it's getting better. The refugee camps are recognising when the conflict arose in Ukraine with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we set up 9 solar community hubs there very quickly, where people could get access to computers. Phone charges is a big issue, getting access to power, and we were able to get people back on, and teachers were coming to these community hubs giving education. And so there are things happening, and I'd like to think there are ways to do, but I can't talk to any more than, because I haven't had the experience of what Hila has, and I'm sure, given that for me it sounds as though it's sheer determination, incredible to your story, and excited to see how we can support people in conflict zones, particularly women in education.
Thanks, Dominic. Hila, I'm going to hand over to you now because I know you have a question for Theo.
Thank you. Girls' education has been a flagship of international policy for the Conservative Party. Will this continue to be the case as we lead up to the next general election? And will the Conservative commit to education financing in their political party manifesto?
Thank you very much, Hila. Well, that's an excellent question for me to ask Andrew Mitchell as your Development Minister. Let me start off by saying I firstly really welcome that the Conservative government in the last few years has been very committed to this agenda. I may not have agreed with our previous Prime Minister Boris Johnson on everything, but I really welcome that the 12 years of quality education was a mantra that he really introduced. And I think sometimes when we have changes of government, policies can get lost. But I really welcome that our new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has recommitted to the girls' education agenda. And I said in my previous remarks that for me, education really is a silver bullet. And for me, I do think it is a very good use of taxpayer money. I think we've had a lot of debates in the last few years about whether we should be spending so much money overseas, particularly when budgets are extremely stretched. I'm always having to explain to my constituents in Stafford, why is it that we're spending money overseas on humanitarian emergencies and the challenges affecting other countries? But I always say that what happens overseas does affect us here at home. And I think education is one of the ways that we can deliver genuine value for taxpayer money when we're spending our overseas aid budget. I think education is something the UK government has really committed to, which is demonstrated not just by the 12 years of quality education being in our previous manifesto, but also I think in terms of actual delivery and the amount of money that the UK government has invested in this. I attended the summit which the UK hosted with Kenya for the Global Partnership for Education. And the fact that £4 billion was pledged at that conference to make sure that we are investing in girls' education and make sure that 130 million girls around the world today are going to get access to go to school. And that was a huge sum of money to be committed by the international community. But I also think it's important to recognise that the UK played a really leading role in convening that summit, and the fact that we were the co-hosts with Kenya to make sure that we kept this focus on the international agenda. And I just wanted to share a personal example, really for me, why education is so important. A few years ago, I went to visit one of the refugee camps in Lebanon with Save the Children. And I went to see some of the tented camps and meet with some of the families in really difficult conditions in the winter, sleeping in tents in the snow. And I met some of the young children who were going to a tented community school which was being funded by the British government. And I remember talking to some of those children who were very young, maybe 10 or 11, and I said to them, what do you want to do? And these are Syrian children, many of them unaccompanied child refugees who'd fled across the border. And they said, we want to go home to Syria, and I want to be a future teacher or an architect or a doctor. So this is really the lost generation, if you like. We need to have these children being educated so that in 10, 15, 20 years' time, they can return to their home countries and start to rebuild their lives and those of their communities. So for me, that's such a great example of really why we must continue to invest in girls' education. And I, as a member of the International Development Select Committee, have made those remarks very strongly to the government, and I will continue to keep their feet to the fire that girls' education must and should remain a priority.
Fantastic, thank you, Theo. Hila, there are many barriers to education in low-income countries, including gender inequality, that continue to hold back millions of children from learning. What types of policies and decisive action do you feel are needed to reverse this tide of the global learning crisis?
I think so far as a young person and coming from a conflict zone, is like we need to stop drafting policies, but start with implementation and accountabilities, because it's 2023, we're still drafting policies and we know what we need to do, but we just don't implement it because there isn't like a strong political will to this. To do anything on the ground, we need to take practical steps in order to make change when it comes to education. When we're doing bilateral aid, when we're financing education in any developing countries, just don't make it temporary. It should be sustainable and long-term. We need like sustainable solution when it comes to education in developing countries and conflict zone. It shouldn't be just like a philanthropy project, but it should be smart diplomacy as well when we're working and making change on the ground. So financing education is one of the key things that we need to do, and this should be sustainable, not project-based, because in Afghanistan and even countries like Pakistan or in African countries, a lot of educational projects are just short-term. We do something, we move out, and there is no sustainable change on the ground. In order to make sustainable change, we need sustainable financing for education. Second would be, it's really important to acknowledge the role of private sector, because there are so many private companies at the developing countries which can play a key role when it comes to reducing the educational crisis at international level. Private sector should invest and work more with the local charity organizations who are working in developing countries and working towards education, because sometimes the government have their own excuses not to fund education in many countries because of budget, but private sector can play a really important role here. They have the money, they should invest at the local level, but how should they invest it? It shouldn't be project based at the same time, not again. Work with the local NGOs because they know the people on the ground, they know the infrastructure. If you're not working with the government for political reasoning and different policies that your government has, but working with the local NGOs on the ground doesn't have many restrictions, start working with them. Third, invest in gender equality initiatives. There are so many programs are happening. It just happens at the capital. That's why, like I always emphasize, like localization is the key to bring sustainable change in any country. When you're working with gender initiatives programs, make sure you're working at the grassroots level, make that change, and having a bottom to top approach is really important for sustainable education, financing education at the international level. Support technological solution. My colleague said that and during COVID, a lot of people are doing online learning and providing education for people who don't have access to education. But we need to acknowledge the digital divide that exists in developing countries and conflict zone. A lot of people don't even have access to internet, don't have access to electricity. They don't have digital literacy to even use a computer or a laptop. I know like during COVID, a lot of people switched to online platform learning, but it's very different in countries like conflict affected countries where just leave internet. People don't have electricity. They have electricity just once a week for 1 hour. So need to acknowledge these things as well when it comes to providing technological support and focus more on solution than problems. One thing another is empower local leaders. There are so many local leaders at the grassroots level who are educational activists who are making changes in their communities. But these people don't get these international platforms to showcase the changes that they're bringing. In a lot of media, we always see countries who are in conflict or developing countries, and they kind of portray a victim mindset of people on the ground. But like there are people who are resilient on the ground. They're making changes in their community. There are so many local actors who need platforms so they can show what they're doing on the ground, the changes that they're making. And we actually need to provide them this platform and support them. And also foster culture exchange programming, because in general, for example, in the UK, the expert knows what's happening in developing countries or conflict zone, and we have policies, we have programs and initiatives. But what about the general public? Because they have an influence as well, because one is asking your government to finance education, one is asking private sector, but what about individuals, like the general public, what you can do on the ground? So that's why when it comes to culture exchange programming, we should invest more on this, and we should also, I want to highlight this. A lot of students or people are going from developing countries visiting conflict zone, and they get a view, a perspective of what's happening. But what about people on the ground coming to a developing countries? There's visa discrimination. They don't have that opportunity to visit the developed infrastructure of educational institution in developing countries. So we need to make a way So that goes both way. People who are on the other side of the globe, they need to have an exposure of what the developing countries are doing in order to finance education and what they are doing in order to foster their education in their countries. And we need to have this, and we need to focus on the visa discrimination and acknowledge passport privileges as well when it comes to education. And the last is policy dialogues. We need to talk to the people on the ground, making sure the talks are continued. There's this famous saying that God give us one mouth and 2 ears. Listen more, speak less. So make sure, like when we're having these dialogues with the community member, with the different faith leaders, with religious leaders, with women, with men as our gender allies, the dialogues are open, but also it should provide a safe space for the people to actually speak about the problems that are having, and we need to listen, and especially as a young person, because when I go to these conferences, like I'm the only one young person in the panel. So it's really important we have those spaces. I just don't want you to listen to me what I'm saying. I want to be heard as well, and I want everyone at the end of this conferences to actually make a small changes and take a small action in order to support any girls who are in developing countries. And there are so many ways you can do that. You can do it just by donating. You can just support, even send a book, provide a helping hand to people and NGOs who are working towards girls' education. So these are my recommendations as a young person, and also someone who have these experience at the grassroots level.
I could see Dominic nodding along there when you mentioned private investment, so that leads me nicely into my final question for Dominic, and then we're going to open it out to audience questions. So if you have them, get ready. Dominic, is global education a cost or investment given the long-term benefits to the private sector, economic growth and jobs?
Well, Hila has spoken so eloquently to a lot of this, so I'll try and give it some additional justice. I'm just very impressed, nodding away indeed, because really believe in everything you're saying. Look, I touched on it in my opening remarks. It's very difficult to invest in countries where there is not a educated group of colleagues to employ, and it is very costly to bring in expats. So I set up an initiative for a factory that I built in Athi River, just outside Nairobi, which, Theo, I hope you do get to visit on your next trip. About 6,000 employees. I would say about 5,500 of them are women, which is fantastic. But we really had to work with the communities, the leaders, the unions as well. Let's not forget the unions. Play a very important role, particularly on protecting people from labour abuses. And we had to work to educate and bring people's skills to a level, because they weren't necessarily there. And we did that through a number of means, and we worked with all parts of the community. So over 56 of my colleagues come from the deaf community. It's very interesting. Former Secretary of State Penny Mordaunt, who can sign language, came and had a session with our deaf workers. But what we did to make sure that there was inclusivity is make sure the colleagues who were able of hearing to also learn sign language. So there was that community coherence. And what we did with the management, who initially were expats, predominantly from Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, India, because very much focused on the garment industry, we said to them that their job is to be out of a job. They have succeeded when they do not have a job to be in, because the local community can become the CEOs, the managing directors, the finance directors, the head of IT. Now, that was my mission, and we were pretty successful in that. We started off with over 150 expats. For a factory of 6,000, it's not that much, but we brought that level down to less than 20, because we transferred that knowledge, we transferred those skills, and we made sure that the ownership and the values of that factory was part of the community. And there was a number of other challenges. I mean, we've spoken a lot about conflict, but I mean, really, there are challenges, particularly for women who might not be able to make a decision on when they choose to give birth. So in Ethiopia, we had a number of women from communities which had become pregnant through force, through rape, a lot of times. So they'd run away to safe houses, and I'd go to the safe houses and I would offer these women paid training, and their biggest concern was, what about the children? and I made it clear that I will provide childcare as well. We did that because, one, I felt a moral duty to not just go to a poor region in Ethiopia and create jobs for the sake of jobs. I wanted to create jobs with meaning, jobs that could make a difference, and jobs could impact lives that were absolutely, in the young women's minds, destitute. So by investing in those women and their children, we created a workforce, a group of over 3,000 colleagues who excelled, whose lives changed around, and whose communities and economies grew. So for the private sector, should we invest? We'll be foolish not to. Now, should the governments invest? I mean, Theo touched upon taxpayers' money. And I think it's a very good point. Taxpayers may see investing in girls' education overseas is not good value for UK taxpayers. The fact is, investing in girls' education domestically or internationally creates jobs. And let's remember, we pay tax on those jobs, that income that we make. It pays back 10 times over. So should the government invest? Yes, it must. But most importantly, if businesses want to play a vital and equitable role in communities, particularly communities which are impacted through poverty, conflict, climate impacts, where there is huge opportunities for those communities, but also for investors, British investors in particular, with their skills on climate, agro, technology. We have to go understanding that we may have to invest in education, but we should, regardless whether we may have to or not. We need to make those differences to communities, and that business that I set up in Kenya, in less than 18 months, did over $50 million in exports. If similar businesses did not make those investments, they were lucky to do $5 million in exports. It demonstrates it. The challenge is, and those of you that are in business here today, your accountants will never be able to calculate that. So when I say we need to feed the staff, they say, well, that's a cost and nothing comes out. The response is, and some of you have heard me say this before, can you work effectively when you're hungry? Mm-hmm. So these are the pushbacks that you always get from the Treasury, Theo, and the accountants, those in business. You might not always see the output on the numbers when you make the investment, but I can assure you, you will see the output in numbers in years to come, but most importantly, building an equitable, sustainable future for communities that need the help of businesses that can afford it.
Thank you, Dominic. And with that, I'm going to open up to audience questions, and I think your hand was up straight away. My colleague Rose is going to go over to you there with the mic. Thank you.
Nick Connor, North West Wales Conservatives. Dominic, I found your contributions excellent and really interesting. I've recently been doing some business in Bangladesh, as we know, big in the garment trade and majority female employed industry. And really close things to the UK, for example, it's 860 million UK pounds invested in Bangladeshi companies. Now, the role of commerce to push female education, I think you could see that in Bangladesh. I think, so I've just asked my colleagues some facts. Sort of 95% of women in Bangladesh between 15 to 24 are in education. More girls in school in Bangladesh than boys. And this has been driven by commerce. But my question is actually about the UK government. So obviously we see a lot from international development, but is there more to be done? For example, in the Department of Trade to ensure that girls' education is being pushed into trade agreements when we're looking at. There's obviously a role for the Treasury where we're looking at ESG criteria, making sure that girls' education is much firmer in sort of lending portfolios.
Thank you for that question. Sorry, what was your name again?
Nick.
Nick, nice to meet you, Nick. I think Theo will probably be able to pick up better on this than I. But you are right, and the themes need to be across departments and they need to be aligned. Sometimes, probably more often than not, they're not aligned. Import strategies versus where development aid goes can often be at loggerheads. But I think what we need to do is threaded through every theme, particularly when we're looking outwards, is making sure that girls' education is protected. We have a triple lock on pensions. I won't comment on that, but it is protected. So how do we get that triple lock on girls' education and make sure that I think through the mission statements of various ministries and departments, that we have to have at the front of our minds, first and foremost, is what are we doing for girls, what are we doing for their education. We believe this is a policy, and I don't think there's a debate about whether it's the right thing or wrong thing. So there's certainly questions about money, and as Theo's touched upon, the UK has been very, very good at supporting that, despite the budget cuts. But how do we protect that? And as to the comment of Hila, how do we have that consistency? And I wonder if Theo, if there's any ideas on it. I see more consistency now on this and other themes.
Brilliant. I'll pick up. Thank you for your question, Nick. So, firstly, on both points. Firstly, the Bangladesh garments example that you gave. In fact, I went on a visit a few years ago and met with the H&M Foundation in Bangladesh, and I met with some of the female garment workers you're describing. I think one thing that I think we haven't really mentioned so much in the debate so far today is that there's the physical thing of building a school and having teachers and quality education, but actually there's a huge amount of allied challenges in the same context. So, for example, the number of girls who are dropping out of school due to the lack of toilet facilities in their school because of having their period is basically a whole week, a month that they're losing from their education. And we know that, for example, things like safety, girls being worried about a long walk if they're having to travel in a rural area, if they're collecting things like firewood and they're being raped or attacked and having physical violence, that's a reason they won't be attending school. So for me, I think the humanitarian budget and ODA is really important for tackling those issues and making sure that we're not just building the school, but we're making sure there's a whole package around these girls to make sure they can attend school. On your point about trade agreements, and I should say I work in the Department for Business and Trade, so the Minister's not here, but I think what they would say is that in our trade agreements we are looking at embedding gender. I spent 3 years working on our trade negotiations for the Kenya Economic Partnership Agreement, and that was one of the things I was really keen that we did embed. So whilst girls' education wouldn't necessarily be specifically included as a clause, because of course that's something that's spent under FCDO rather than my department, I do think there is become an increasing focus on gender, and I think adding in a particular chapter on that into trade agreements is something that I'm very supportive of, and it's certainly something that I pushed in my own market.
Thank you, Theo. I'll take 2 questions now just because of time. So the lady at the front, please, and then the gentleman at the front.
Good afternoon, speakers.
We have a mic.
I just, in my opinion, in countries where women's position are higher economically and culturally, usually those countries are more immune to wars and extremism, because I think women are more inclined not to choose violence as a resort to resolve conflicts. And so would it be a compelling argument that gives the more incentives to developed countries to have more support to women education all over the world? And how can we use this argument to lobby, say, the British government or the EU or America to have more support, to have more fundings to help build girls' education in some troubled areas? Thank you.
Oh, right. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. My name's John Davis. I have got some experience of this. Been involved in setting up a small NGO organisation. All right. I will use that. Thank you. Dealing with access for girls, not only education but also birth control. This is a really complex issue. A couple of things strike me. If we relate it back to an issue in the UK, we've got the stop the boats issue. I would use that as a starting point, because I believe one of our absolute best interests for our global security in dealing with issues like that is actually to start from self-interest. And that self-interest is best supported by dealing with the problems you've enumerated. So that's position number one. In getting that message across to the public, your own interest starts there. It's looking after yourself as well. The moral argument's very good, but go for people's own interest. The next thing is in terms of discrimination. I mean, discrimination, you mentioned in a lot of forms. There's a co-part of this is access to girls, access for women for birth control, which you mentioned. I see these two running in parallel, because not having that often pulls women and girls out of those opportunities. In terms of investment in NGO, I agree again, the money in putting it in, I would strongly argue that the private sector is the best mechanism. Government does not always respond tactically as well. So the next thing I think we're looking at, what can the government do? There's plenty of tax breaks for doing X, Y and Z. You've only got to look at some of the tax breaks in the city. Could we not use the tax break system to industry to actually make that stronger? Because the catch to all this, as has been pointed out, it's got to be self-sustaining at a local level. If it isn't, it doesn't work. And there's one final question I've got, which is from Hila's story herself. And it is relevant. How on earth do you manage that in a regime that, shall we say, is not terribly liberal and is rather inclined to shoot people and do other things to them? You know, and how do you break into that? Because this is one of the big barriers. I mean, you've got personal experience, but how do we get around that? Because if you roll up with the Taliban offering X, Y and Z, probably not going to get that far, I wouldn't have thought.
Thank you. Okay, so if I can start off with Hila with the first question. How can we promote and support women in leadership roles, and what's the wider impact in conflict zones? Sort of your first question?
Yes. If women with a higher position or with in power is, because to be frank, in maybe I'm politically incorrect, women actually would not be more is not as men who easily choose violence or war to solve problems.
Yeah, okay. Hila, you kick that off for me quickly,
Yeah.
thank you.
So I've been working in the field of peace building for 5 years, and we have experienced this, that women experience war differently comparing to men, so they bring different solution. And in many countries, because in Afghanistan we had a peace process going on for several years, and we were working, my NGO works on preventing violent extremism and how we can link peace building to education. And what we found out in a lot of our local communities where there's conflict between two tribal leaders or in conflict, women were the peacemakers. They were actually bringing those solutions in a peaceful manners in order to make change in their community. And if you read and research about the data, in a lot of countries where peace agreement was implemented and where women were involved in those peace building agreementation and implementation, the peace lasted longer in those countries because women were the negotiators, women were the peace builders. So peace building is really important, especially when it comes to leadership role. A lot of women who are involved in this peace negotiation and peace agreements, they brought very sustainable solution to these countries, because obviously war and violence is never an answer to any problem. But how do we actually bring more women peace builders when it comes to these type of solutions and these type of problems? First, start with meaningful participation. In a lot of countries, women have leadership positions which are more symbolic, but when it comes to decision-making processes, it's mostly men, and women are not meaningfully involved. But when I talk about women, I also want to talk about young women and how they're discriminated and excluded for a lot of peace agreement implementation or peace processes, or actually providing that peaceful resolution. In a lot of developing countries and conflict zones, more than 60% of population are young people. But oftentimes young people are considered as perpetrators of violence because they're getting recruited by these extremist groups, and then women also suffer a lot of sexual violence, gender-based violence, but we don't talk enough about how war is impacting these women, but how women peace builders are making and bringing these solutions. But like I mentioned previously, in order to make sure that we have a meaningful leadership at the international level, the role shouldn't be symbolic, but we should also have leadership at the grassroots level as well. We have women at the international platform that should support women at the grassroots level as well in terms of leadership, especially peace builders. Because if you're working as a woman in peace building, first thing is safety is really important, because working in peace building and peace process is not an easy job, especially if you're like convincing two parties not to use war as a solution. It takes a lot of courage, it takes a lot of power, and it takes a lot of support that is needed for a lot of young women peace builders. And I work in peace building and peace justice as one of the SDG goals in Afghanistan. And we use women as mediators when it comes to any conflict, and we saw the positive results, how women can bring that peaceful resolution to any conflict in any community. So I think empowering women, peace builders at the local level is really important, but also the acknowledgement that women can bring a lot of peaceful resolution and peaceful solution to a lot of conflicts that are happening in other countries. And we should bring examples of all the peace agreements that have been implemented in other countries and how women played a significant role, but also acknowledge the role of young women. Should I answer the second question?
Well, if I just bring Theo in quickly on that as well, and then Hila, we can go back to you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, Theo.
Yes, just firstly on your point also about political participation, I think you should make an important point about political leadership. So for example, in Rwanda, more than 50% of their members of parliament are female, which is obviously not the case in most parliaments around the world. And I do think that increasing female representation would make a big difference. And on your question, sir, I totally agree with you on your point about the argument that we deploy to make the case. And I think too often when we talk about the overseas aid budget, we always tend to talk about the moral argument, which I absolutely support and I agree with. I do think it's important we're helping people in need. But I think you're absolutely right. I think we need to not shy away from talking about the national interest argument as well. In my own constituency in Stafford, which is just down the road from Manchester, we have a huge issue where the Home Office has proposed to send nearly 600 asylum seekers to a huge proposed centre in the heart of my small county town. As you can imagine, residents are extremely upset about it. There have been protests, we've done a huge campaign to try and stop that centre being sent. But it leads exactly to your point that the British public are concerned about immigration levels and also the routes to the UK that people are using to try and get here illegally. And I think if we can be working in those countries and in those conflict zones to be tackling the root causes, then the reasons why people would be fleeing in the first place, I mean, they wouldn't actually arrive here in the UK. So I think we need to do one thing, which is obviously support people who've arrived here in the UK and make sure they're being deported if they're here illegally. But there's the second point, which is actually investing in those countries. So one of the arguments I always use when I'm talking to colleagues who are a bit more sceptical about why we have an overseas development budget at all is to say that actually if we can stop these problems upstream at source, then it prevents it becoming a problem. And I think migration is really the highest we've seen for decades. If you think of the proportion of people now on the move, it's actually higher than at any point since World War II. So in terms of the number of refugees and internally displaced people, this is a problem that's not going to go away overnight, and we need to have countries working together. And I think one of the very good things, in fact, that David Cameron did as Prime Minister was to set up, for example, the scheme in Syria, where we set up a placement scheme where we could basically interview and select refugees who are genuine refugees making an asylum seeker claim and actually expatriate them from Syria straight to the UK. I've got refugees, for example, from Ukraine living in my constituency who are being well looked after by local residents and being integrated into the community. And it's really important we have those safe and legal routes, but at the same time we need to be tackling the source upstream. And for me, you've got to do both.
So there was a tax issue.
I've got an idea on the tax, but
Dominic, 30 seconds.
no, you made a good point about incentivising private sector to invest. There's a investment opportunity called Enterprise Investment Scheme. Okay, investors, you get 30% back if you invest into an Enterprise Investment Scheme qualifying company. 30% back on your income tax. So if you invest £100,000 into a British business, you get 30,000 back on your income tax in the UK. It's very successful, supported by the Treasury, does very well, and something that has helped a lot of small businesses. However, the conditions on enterprise investment schemes are often limited to the type of business operations that they're doing. And I won't get to technicalities on that, but I do believe there's an opportunity to turn this into what we call the ethical investment scheme. And I know we're not here to talk about more policies because there's a lot, but this is an incentive. If we can if the Treasury can rewrite the conditions around that to make sure you're not investing in a business that's only employing men, you're not investing in a business which is creating extra carbons, you're not investing in a business which pays women less than men, then that would turn a huge amount of these investments into ethical investments, because at the moment you can invest, you get your tax back, and they can go and produce a load of carbon and pay women less than men. I think there's an opportunity there for you.
Thank you. We're going to wrap it up now because unfortunately we're out of time. I just want to say a massive thank you to the Global Partnership for Education, Theo, Hila, Dominic. Thank you so much.